Are you struggling with individuals who come to you with a history of suicide behavior? This is a very common challenge faced by mental health practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, as well as parents and teachers. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you 7 important insights that you need to have to be able to manage such situations and individuals. First, and the most important thing, we need to recognize and differentiate self-harm from suicide behavior. Suicide behavior includes active suicidal thoughts, history of planning, as well as history of attempt. This is separate from self-harm, where the individual is just diverting attention by creating a different pain to move away from the existing situation. Here, the intention is not to take the life. It's called non-suicidal self injury. So that's point number 1, where we understand the difference between self-harm and suicide behavior. Suicide behavior includes suicidal thoughts, history of plans, or attempt. Usually in our records, 15% of the individuals in the suicide behavior group have a history of attempt. So not everybody who has thoughts or plans end up attempting it. This is one important background you must have. Point number 2, when we assessed these individuals who came with a history of suicide behavior, again, that includes thoughts, plan, or attempt, we were shocked to learn that 95% of the individuals with a history of suicide attempt were positive for the assessment of complex PTSD or PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is significant because complex PTSD or PTSD has a series of challenging issues that the individual is already facing. Examples: re-experience, sense of threat, avoidance, issues with self-esteem, depression, relationship issues, and functionality impairment. So all of these situations are already present in most of the people who have history of suicide behavior. So if you are not assessed for those situations, you must understand and assess them and identify the root cause of that. Individuals with history of suicide attempt, nearly all of them have some form of trauma imprint already, and more likely during their childhood. Point number 3, individuals with history of suicide attempt, again, nearly 95% of them have a history of self-harm somewhere much before the suicide behavior started to come into the picture. So in sequence, usually self-harm is an early warning indicator, followed by suicidal thoughts, planning, and attempt. And self-harm, as I've explained before, is where there is no intention to take life. It is a situation where an individual is not able to go through the extreme negative emotion, and the idea is to distract through non-suicidal self-injury. So please note that there are early warning signs such as self-harm, which is not actually suicide behavior. However, it's an important risk factor for a later suicide behavior or an attempt history. Point number 4, again, 90% of the individuals in the suicide behavior group have a history of eating disorder. Now we talk about eating disorder as a range of situations, and I'm not going to go into that. Please note that binge eating, emotional eating is very common again in individuals who present with history of suicide behavior. So again, it provides you an early warning indicator, and before eating disorder, you can assume that there has been a situation of extreme stress experienced by the individual, and all of that happens much before the suicide behavior. So this is an important point. Point number 5, as an observer or as a caregiver or a psychotherapist or a psychologist, we tend to understand irrationality in decision making, but that's not how the individual who comes to us with such history understands. So irrational decision making is another common factor in many individuals with history of suicide behavior. For perspective, 80% of the people in the suicide behavior group have a history of taking irrational decisions. Examples: an individual is struggling during childhood at a home environment, wants to get out of the home. Where he or she wants to go is not important. So the irrational decision in such case involves getting out of the home as a stress driver. But where and how, what I will do is not important. This ends up as an irrational decision much later in the life, where what I went to study was not important. I had to just get out of that environment. And where and how the person studied becomes irrational decision later. And these are big decisions that alter the course of life. So look for such situations, such as taking irrational decisions. And obviously, when an individual attempts to take life or does self-harm, also in a way becomes an irrational decision for most people around that individual. So, point number 6, and this is well known, however I'm repeating because as you can see in the references, this is very common in individuals with history of suicide attempt or behavior. High levels of depression, feeling of loneliness is very common in individuals with history of suicide behavior. Now, depression also has its contributors, and that goes back to childhood experiences that I'm going to cover later. So depression caused by root causes such as adverse childhood experiences, and the path includes high levels of insomnia issues as well as anxiety leading to depression. And for most people, the self-assessed depression score is far higher than even the cutoff for major depressive disorder. So depression is very common. Loneliness also is a common contributor to depression and is present in many individuals with suicide behaviors. So this summarizes point number 6. And finally, the last but not the least important point, number 7. If I go back to root causes, and before I do that, let me explain. The suicidal thoughts, plan or attempt is happening at that moment, and it's important that we recognize that moment and find a way to intervene and prevent. However, the root cause is much deeper and leads us to the childhood traumatic environment. And our research, not yet published, highlights several such experiences. More commonly, the history of emotional abuse and emotional neglect coupled with physical abuse or sexual abuse is a common contributor to long-term risk. Now, the suicidal thoughts and attempt may be triggered by some events such as relationship issues, extreme stress during the studies. However, those individuals who have such history are more likely to succumb to such pressure at that point of time. So this is an important contributor, and point number 7 that you must recognize. When you connect these dots, also recognize that additional components of childhood trauma such as experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence or mental health issues or a history of suicide in the family also is a major contributor to the risk of both self-harm and suicide behavior, and the work must look at identifying the root cause and eventually addressing it. So that's point number 7. To summarize, there are several important points that medical doctors, psychiatrists, mental health practitioners, psychologists, psychotherapists must understand with respect to suicide behavior, and I've attempted to highlight several of them based on global evidence and our own scientific study. You can look at references below in the description. Now, having understood what are the contributors, we need to make sure we do trauma-informed care approach in terms of solution, and there are several components with respect to being sensitive and empathetic to the trauma situation that the person has. So suicide has a background in trauma. The individual with history of suicidal thoughts or behavior has that trauma background, and therefore trauma-sensitive approach or trauma-informed care is absolutely necessary. Second, to address, we need to use the idea of index trauma. Again, you can look at our PTSD research where we talk about how to identify index trauma events that need to be addressed. So index trauma event assessment is absolutely critical, and like we talk in inner child integration or healing the child within, we usually draw up a timeline and identify several events and then pick up index trauma event that needs to be addressed. Fourth, the inner child integration or reconsolidation of traumatic memory is an intervention method we use to address the index trauma events, and we find dramatic recoveries in depression. Looking back, and the individual is able to laugh at the history of self-harm or recognize the history of irrational decision making or the eating disorders or the perception of loneliness. And when all of this is managed together, we increase the ability of the individual to come out of that depression, come out of those irrational decision making, history of self-harm. The complex trauma or PTSD assessment turns green, and therefore individual does not represent those symptoms. And with all of this combined with trauma-informed care approach, we are able to take individual out of that situation. And I hope to together 7 points and the approach we take in our Release Reframe Toolkit can help you plan it. Last but not the least important, we have also assessed several hundred individuals using the ASQ assessment. You can again read the description. It's a very powerful suicide risk assessment tool that gives you an early warning. And we have 2 individuals independently assess this, and based on the risk, we also consult psychiatrist if we have doubts that there is a risk that individual carries. So we do not take the individuals right on, head on. We do all these assessments by 2 individual experts, as well as consult a psychiatrist if you have doubt, who goes through a similar independent assessment, and then together 3 of us decide should we pursue the intervention or not.